on the screen here. That will put up on the screen. On the screen. On the screen. Yeah. Is it on now? Okay, good. We're ready. Our guest is here. Good morning, everyone. Peaceful and fulfilling Lent as we start this on our Ash Wednesday. So can you hear this better now? Okay. We want to give a special thank you to our guest, Ellen Hubbard, who is weathered the storm from coming from another location, other guest. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Erin is the Vice President of Advocacy with LeadingAge Minnesota, an organization I was not familiar with, so I'm very eager to hear about it and to see if possibly there's a way we could collaborate with them. So after Governor Walz sent his budget proposal to the legislature with several cuts, severe cuts to senior services, we found LeadingAge. It's an agency that advocates for seniors, and we invited Erin to come and speak to us about public policy and how we can be engaged. So let's give a big welcome to Erin and thank her for coming.
Thank you so much. For those who are participating from a cozy room, okay, please feel free to drop something into the chat if you have a question, and we'll hopefully be able to see those come up on the screen. I did wear my boots today, so you'll see I'm a pretty practical girl at the end of the day. So thank you so much for having me. I will tell you a little bit about the organization that I work for, but I do want the focus to remain on the budget that the legislature has to pass, the budget that Congress will have to pass, which are happening concurrently, and then hopefully have a bit of time for discussion on how we can all work together. So I have this presentation from something I did last week, and I thought it was still relevant, so I'm going to reuse a couple of slides. So this is more formal, probably, than what we really need for today, but I did want to give you a sense of what I hope you'll learn from our conversation. So understanding the political landscape of the 2025 Minnesota legislature, some of those emerging public policies. We'll talk about the governor's budget. And then we'll talk about some public priorities that I hope I get to bring forward to the legislature this year on behalf of the people that I am paid to represent, in addition to the things that I hope we get to do as a community for everyone that benefits seniors. Uh-oh. Okay. So this is a slide that I like to start with whenever I'm doing a presentation with another group, because I don't want to make the assumption that everyone understands why they should be interested in the intersection between public policy and senior care. And it really is because the state government touches everything that long-term care services offers, provides, and receives payment for. So a couple of the examples. So licensing is how places like Presbyterian Homes or St. Therese, which is a Catholic organization nearby, how they get licensed by the Department of Health. That is regulated by the state government. how those types of providers are paid for offering services is regulated by the state government. Policies that promote workforce development. So the state of Minnesota has recognized that the long-term care sector is one of its drive for 5 career industries. In other words, it is an industry that needs to see rapid growth and development of the number of people pursuing careers in this field. We actually, at my organization, survey long-term care providers who do things like nursing home care or assisted living or independent senior housing. And we get a sense of how many job vacancies we have across the state. And in 2022, that number hit a high water mark. So right after the pandemic, the field had about 23,000 open positions across the state. That is an enormous number of vacancies, and it is why you were seeing so many challenges with staff and people feeling like they were overworked. It's because they were. We were short 23,000 positions. In the last 3.5 years, through in large part because of decisions made at the legislature and through decisions made by provider organizations, we've been able to bring that vacancy number down. So our most recent data shows us that we have about 12,500 vacancies across the sector, across the state. So still a lot of job openings. 12,000 is still a lot of openings, but significantly better than 23,000. And then things that you are afforded as residents and consumers, your rights and protections are also encumbered in state law. Maybe the battery on this might be a little short today. Okay, we'll spend a few moments talking about the political landscape. If you want to go ahead to the next one, this was just a cover slide. So Minnesota's economic forecast. So unlike the weather forecast, which dumped a bunch of snow on us today, the economic forecast projects how much revenue the state is going to have to spend to balance its 2-year budget. It will also predict what sorts of variables it can predict that might change that revenue projection. And we have a fairly big budget in the state of Minnesota. We are a very fortunate state. We have a tax system that brings in a fair amount of revenue to support a really robust set of services and supports for people in Minnesota. However, in December, the last time the state did an economic forecast, they projected a $616 million surplus for the biennium. Now, the biennium in Minnesota is not measured from January 1 to December 31st, because that would be the easier thing to do. They start their biennium, they start their fiscal year on July 1st. So from July 1st to June 30th, there's a 2-year period of time that the state has to balance a budget for. And so for that 2-year period of time between 2026 and 2027, they predict that we'll have about $616 million more than what they last predicted we would have to spend, so a surplus, which sounds like a lot, but $616 million doesn't actually stretch that far when you think about 7 million people and all of the ways that we need to serve the state of Minnesota. They also had a huge caution sign, and that caution sign was that in the next biennium, so starting in fiscal year 2028, they actually predict that we'll go into a $5 billion deficit, and that is where the state's expected spending outpaces how much it is expected to collect in terms of revenue through taxes. Now, these two numbers do not take into account anything that's happening at the federal level right now. So that is another asterisk that we really have to take into consideration. So within that budget forecast, you get a sense of what is driving some of those numbers. And within that December forecast, it said that spending growth, sort of that projected cost for growth within long-term care services, they do anticipate that expenditures they're planning to go up. Now that makes sense, you would think, because we have more people that are getting older in the state of Minnesota who need services like elderly waiver or nursing home care. So it makes sense that those dollars, those cost dollars, would go up over time. They also anticipated that services under other kinds of Medicaid waivers for people with disabilities, for example, are also projected to go up over time. And so they are going to receive, the state lawmakers are going to receive an updated forecast tomorrow. Tomorrow is March 6th. And we will get a better sense of whether we're still coming in at 616 million surplus for the biennium, whether that number has changed, how they want to try to account for what may happen at the federal level. So tomorrow is a pretty big day for elected officials in the state of Minnesota. And with that updated forecast, they will have to set how they want to craft a 2-year budget. So, next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the politics because I think that does have a lot to do with the priorities that you're seeing advancing in the legislature, particularly the things that you see in the media or see people saying when they go on like Almanac or TPT. So the last 2 years, that last election cycle, the Democrats got to be in the majority in the House, they got to be in the majority in the Senate, and then they held the governor's office. So they had what we considered a trifecta. And that meant that if you had DFL priorities, those kind of ran the table. And if you were someone who had more conservative leanings or more Republican leanings, you had a much more difficult time trying to get any traction or support for your issues over the last 2 years. The November election changed that quite a bit. So the governor, as you may recall, was on the presidential ticket as the VP nominee and did not win his election bid to the White House. So he actually returns to Minnesota to carry out the remaining 2 years of his term as governor. This was actually his first election loss since he ran for Congress in the mid-2000s. So for those of you who have voted in every single election since about 2006 or earlier, this is the first time he's actually lost. The Senate keeps a 1-seat Democratic majority, and then the House actually, they found themselves in a position they've only been in one other time in statehood history, and that is that they will find themselves in a tie. So at the moment, the Republicans have a 1-seat majority, a 67-66 majority, and that is because there is one race in Roseville that still has to have a special election, which is, I think, next week. So in the next 10 days or so, that race will most likely be won by a Democrat and will return the House to a 67-67 tie. And that has only happened one other time in the entire state of Minnesota. And what is interesting about that is you need 68 votes to pass a bill in the legislature. You also need 68 votes to just conduct the business of the legislature, to move bills from one committee to another, to consider amendments, to make any forward progress at all. You need 68. So when that House moves back to a tie, it requires bipartisanship to make any progress at all. The last thing that I want to touch on are some of the things that were inherited and carried into the legislative session that are perhaps adding to some of the pressure and the temperature in the room, some of the oxygen that's being spent under the Capitol. And that is people who served in last election, or who served in the last session. They're an incumbent this year. They're in their 3rd year as an elected lawmaker or more. They saw a very chaotic end to the 2024 legislative session. And I would imagine you all had 5,000 better things to do with your time than watch the end of session at midnight on a random Monday in May. However, if you were so inclined, what ended up happening was around 10 p.m. on Sunday night, they have to kind of finish all of their business by midnight. They were running out of time to complete their work. So the House passed a tax bill that had the tax bill plus 7 other budget bills kind of tucked inside of it off of the floor. And then the Senate, in the final probably 10 minutes of the session before the clock hit midnight, passed that same bill. So there was a lot of consternation about whether process was held to, whether people had a chance to read what was in that 1,500-page bill. There was a lot of rhetoric being passed back and forth about whether it was somebody's fault or somebody else's fault. But at the end of the day, the clock struck 12, those two bills were passed, and there were a lot of very pent-up feelings about it. And then they hit the campaign trail about those pent-up feelings, and it's still kind of percolating there. So there's a lot of pressure to perhaps not repeat those kinds of choices in last May, but also a sense of justice or payback for people who feel like they were aggrieved through that process. Some of the other variables that we're talking about this year is there was a fair amount of turnover in the House. So between the last election cycle and this one, we find ourselves in a position where less than 15 members of the House, now mind you, there are 168 members of the House, and almost a dozen of them have ever served in the legislature during a deficit year. The vast majority of them have only ever served in a year where there was a surplus. And that is a very different place to be in if you're thinking about how to make the least bad of bad choices, as opposed to getting to spend money on pet projects or things that have been underfunded for years. That also corresponds to their partisan staff. So if you work for the House Democrats or work for the House Republicans, there are very few staff who have had to govern in a deficit year. And so it is just a little bit of a change in mindset and change in approach that many of them don't have the experience doing. We've touched on this a little bit, but there's a really volatile economic forecast, even more so now that we're talking about a budget process at the federal level. And then the last variable, which is really more impactful for individuals like me who have to be at the Capitol on a regular basis, but does impact those who want to meet with their lawmaker and engage in the civic process. The House of Representatives is closed for the next 2 years because their office building is undergoing a much overdue renovation. Their building is very old. Their rooms are not the most accessible places to be. But that means that they are working from temporary office spaces for 2 years, and it's very difficult to get access to your lawmaker for the next 2 years, particularly your House member. So for constituents, it's just one more barrier you have to get through to meet with them. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. Okay, one more. We'll talk a little bit about some of the things that are kind of framing the debate this year. So at the federal level, we'll talk about Medicaid. Medicaid is a program that is both state and federally administered and financed, and it is how states pay for services for people who are low income. And every state does it a little bit differently, but it is a state and a federal partnership. In a state like Minnesota, for the most part, if Minnesota puts in $1, the federal government puts in $1. There are a couple of small exceptions, but that's for the most part how it works. In other states, like Louisiana, for example, they put in 30 cents, and then the federal government puts in 70 cents. So they actually get a bigger match from the federal government than their state does. And so there are reasons behind that, but it's important to know that a state like Minnesota is 50-50 and other states have different federal matches. So as Congress thinks about how they want to pass their budget, any choice that they make to Medicaid, as an example, has a really big impact on the state's budget. So if Congress decides to say, we're going to try to rein in that federal deficit, we're going to try to rein in federal spending, the one way we're going to do that is we are going to drop how much we're willing to chip in to the Medicaid program. So Minnesota, if you want to put in $1, that's fine. We're only going to put in 80 cents. You can imagine how much that will quickly compound over time. So if they only put in 80 cents as opposed to the $1 that they used to put in, Minnesota would then be responsible for making up that 20-cent difference or dropping the cost of the services that they cover to make up that 20-cent difference. So they either have to find it in revenue or they have to find it in savings. That's just an example. I'm not here to say that they're dropping their match by 20 cents, but you can see, again, how quickly that compounds and how that would impact the state budget. That has nothing to speak for tariffs or any of these other things that are kind of taking up a lot of oxygen in Washington, D.C., but those would certainly have an impact as well. I know Presbyterian Homes, which has, I know has some support with this organization here, has estimated that some of the tariffs that the president has signed into law would have a pretty big impact on their ability to make upgrades and investments in the properties that they have, in the buildings that they have. So it isn't something that is abstract. It's a very real thing that can impact the services that you see, the amenities that you have, and the things that providers can finance in the future. At the state level, that looming deficit is a really big deal. It's put a big wet blanket on the spending appetite of lawmakers. They are very reluctant to spend any of that surplus in the near term if it requires any ongoing obligation moving past this 2-year budget cycle, which for us in senior care is almost always the case. There are very few things that are short-term in nature, especially when you're talking about benefits. You can't offer someone a benefit and then take it away 2 years later. You can't give someone a raise and then take that away 2 years later. So most of the things that we are talking about at the legislature for us are ongoing expenses, which is why I think we were really surprised and disappointed to see the governor's budget. While I certainly understand the position that he's in, where there is this looming deficit, he balances his budget on people who are low income, people with disabilities, and seniors. His budget cuts were directly targeted to special education services, cuts to nursing home facilities, and then putting what he would characterize as a cap on services for people who receive like disability waivers under Medicaid. And to be very honest, a cap on services is the same thing as a cut. It is another way of saying cut that doesn't sound as harsh. But there's no way that you can hold a provider to a cap on how much they can spend without that impacting services. So for example, he proposes to put a 2% cap on the operating rate of a nursing home. And so the operating rate of a nursing home pays for things like the food that the residents eat, the activities that they enjoy, and the wages of the staff in the nursing home. And so you tell me how that doesn't impact services or jobs by holding a 2% rate. We have to pay for $8 eggs now, just like everybody else. So this becomes very real. These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They are real things that mean real services and real support to people. Okay, let's go ahead to the next slide. I think I covered this. We can skip this one too. I got ahead of myself. Okay, so I wanted to pull out a couple of quotes. This was maybe more of interest to the other group that I was presenting with, but I'm curious how this will resonate with many of you. This is just a sampling of some of the press that I've seen in the last 6 months. So I'll read those out loud because the type is pretty small. One of the reasons for the rising cost of healthcare and decreased quality of care is the influx of private companies and real estate investment trusts. And I'm curious if that resonates with any of you. Is there a concern about sort of the influence of private money influencing the cost of care? Okay. Another increasing number of states are looking at legislation related to private equity in healthcare and long-term care. And then the third quote says, more than a dozen states have passed laws that require corporate buyers, such as private equity firms, to notify states of planned healthcare acquisitions. In some cases, these laws let state authorities actually block deals if they consider them against the public interest. We've seen a little bit of this conversation starting in Minnesota. It's certainly not the driving conversation of the day. I think what I find interesting is here in Minnesota, the vast majority of long-term care providers are either government-owned or nonprofit-owned. There are a few that are privately held or privately owned, maybe a for-profit organization, but the vast majority are faith-based, nonprofit, or government-owned, like they might be owned by the local city. Which I think does add a different color to how we prioritize policy here versus maybe what happens in other states. If you go to a state like Florida, for example, that it's almost the reverse. The vast majority of providers in Florida are for-profit or privately held, not for profit or faith-based. Wonderful. Okay, so here are kind of the big three areas of focus for the legislature at this point in time. I think it'll look a little different after that forecast comes out tomorrow. But the first thing is fraud, waste, and abuse. Who has heard a headline lately about fraud, waste, and abuse? Fraud, waste, and abuse. It is, I think this is my personal take. So I am a person of one, a sample size of one. I think there is some truth to fraud, waste, and abuse. I don't know that we will find $5 billion of savings in fraud, waste, and abuse. So, there's like the talking point and then there's the reality. I think people are very worried about the impact of federal budget changes. I would maybe add, again, my personal color commentary here. If you've had a conversation with a lawmaker lately and they have said, oh, I'm so worried about the federal budget, that is absolutely fair. They should be worried about the federal budget. They should not take their eye off the ball, however, because the state budget is also very important, and it is the state budget that they have a responsibility to pass. And it is the state budget that the governor is proposing to cut senior care services. So yes, worry about the federal government, but don't take your eye off the ball on the state's responsibility either. The last thing that's taking up a lot of oxygen in the room are what needs to be kind of fixed or amended or clarified from the last 2 years. They passed a record number of legislation in 2023 and 2024. Some of those things simply require modifications, amendments, clarifications. And so some of that is non-controversial and bipartisan. Other things are much more partisan and much more controversial. And so you'll hear a lot of back and forth about what needs to be fixed and whether it should be characterized as a fix or not in the first place. Okay. So let's get into aging service policy specifically. So LeadingAge Minnesota, the organization that I work for, is a member-based association. Organizations pay dues to that association, and they, in exchange for those dues, they receive things like technical assistance. So they'll say, I am a nursing home administrator in Staples, Minnesota, and I don't understand what this rule means. Can you explain it to me? And so we help them understand what the rule means and how to comply with the rule. They'll have a chance to, through their dues, receive continuing education to maintain any of the licenses that they may be required to have. And then one of the other major things they get from their dues is the ability to have their needs represented at the Capitol, and that's where I come in. So I am what they consider a lobbyist, which sometimes carries with it like a dirty connotation. Sometimes we get a bad rap, and that is a fair bad rap, I think, for some. I would say the way that I operate as a lobbyist is I am a problem solver and I am an information provider, because members of the legislature come from every background, every type of experience. They may have a huge depth of experience in criminal justice because they are an attorney or maybe a defense lawyer, but they have never stepped a day inside a senior care living facility. And so if they have a question about what it's like to work in a senior living facility, then I am happy to help provide them with that information or connect them with a senior living facility in their district. So I'm a problem solver and I am an information provider. I, this year, have 4 main responsibilities at the legislature, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the other types of things that I get to work on that maybe are not my primary objective, but things that are still really important nonetheless. The first thing that I am trying to do is I am trying to, A, make sure that those governor's cuts don't get passed and signed into law. And 2, to actually ensure we are paying for services that pay for wages, that pay for food, that pay for activities. I don't think it is fair to point to the growth in the population of older adults and use that as a scapegoat for why the cost is out of control. Cost is growing in the state for long-term care services because the number of people getting older is also growing in the state of Minnesota. You are becoming a group of majority. By 2030, which is not that far away now, it's only 5 years away, a quarter of the state's population will be over 65. So that's not that far away. And I don't think it is right, I don't think it is just to say, oh, just because we have more older people in the state of Minnesota, now we have to start ramping down and cutting services. That's not fair to any of you. That's certainly not fair to the people who care for you. The next thing I'm supposed to do this year at the legislature is limit the statutory scope of this regulatory board. This gets very in the weeds and very wonky, so I'm only going to spend a fraction of our time on it. There is a new regulatory board in the state of Minnesota that has the ability to pass any regulation, just like other regulatory boards would, but they don't have spending authority that belongs with the legislature. So this board has passed a regulation, a rule or a mandate that says if you work in a nursing home and you're a certified nurse aide or an LPN or an RN, or you meet these other classifications of jobs, then starting in 2026, you're guaranteed to make a certain dollar an hour in 2026, and then a certain dollar an hour in 2027. And I think the challenge with what they have chosen to do is, again, they don't have spending authority, only the legislature does. So they have now required to meet this minimum wage standard, but they don't get to decide where the money goes. So they have, in essence, made a requirement that the legislature now doesn't have any opportunity to say, we don't want to fund that, you can't do it, or sure, that sounds like a great idea, here's the money. So we believe that this board really shouldn't be able to make spending decisions on behalf of the legislature. That is the legislature's job. They are elected to serve in that body. This board is appointed. So it's a vastly different scope of responsibilities and a vastly different scope of what that board should be able to do. If they wanted to pass a rule that said, you know, a person in a nursing home should have access to a bathroom, I think that would be a different conversation. They already have access to a bathroom, so that's maybe a poor example on my part, but that's different than trying to mandate things that require state money. And then the last thing that I'm trying to get done is accelerate the pipeline of this type of worker called the trained medication aide. And really this is in service of, again, trying to address that 12,000 vacancy problem we have in the state of Minnesota. So every year we have a number of workforce solutions that we bring forward. And this year one of them is you can become a trained medication aide. So if you work in assisted living, if you work in a nursing home, they don't really work that much in senior housing, but some do. You can be a CNA, that sort of entry level certified nurse aide. And then with some extra training, you can actually be able to help pass medications to residents. And not only does that give you higher pay, it gives you a higher scope of work. It's a step ladder up in terms of your responsibilities and our pathway to promotion. And right now, if you want to get that training, you can only do it if you go through a higher education institution, so through the university or through the M-State program. And that just doesn't work for a lot of people today, to have to go to a campus and have this training, or to be able to rely on it only in the spring semester or only in the fall semester. The reality is that they should be able to do that training at their workplace at a time that fits their schedule. And so we have legislation that's going to expand those training opportunities. Go ahead to the next one. And then some of the other things that I'm going to work on this year that are really important to me, and I'll actually even touch on one that isn't on the agenda today. Any given day, I'm given an opportunity to evaluate legislation that somebody else introduces. Somebody else thinks that they have a really great idea, and maybe it is a really great idea, or maybe they have a really great idea that is less of a great idea. And I get to say, hey, here's your bill. Have you considered this thing? Or have you thought about, how it would impact that particular issue? And so today I get to go back to the Capitol where there is a bill in the Senate that would expedite when law enforcement has the ability to locate someone if their family member can't find them and they have a dementia diagnosis. So it gives law enforcement more tools to act more quickly if a family member is worried about where their loved one is out in the community. That's not something that we saw coming. We didn't know that a legislator was going to introduce that bill, but I'm really happy and honored that they've asked us to weigh in and evaluate whether that is something that is helpful or not in this state. So some of the other things that I'm looking at this year include things like allowing our licensed practical nurses, who are, again, are licensed nurses in the state of Minnesota, to work to the top of their license or scope in assisted living settings. There's this thing that they can do called a focused assessment that they can do if they're working in a clinic, that they can do if they're working in a hospital, that they can do if they're working as a home health aide. But for some silly reason, if they're working in assisted living, they're not allowed to do that assessment. So we are trying very hard to let them do what they can do in any other setting and work to the top of their scope. There are any number of bottleneck problems with our Medicaid assessment process. So if any of you are on a Medicaid waiver, you had to go through a county assessment with Ramsey County here. And that assessment process is supposed to be done within 20 days. If it's not done within 20 days, then your services don't get covered by your provider. Sometimes you have to start over and do the paperwork again. It's this huge problem, and we have found that in some counties, the average assessment is being done in 20 days and only 10% of the time. So 90% of the time, they're not meeting that 20-day requirement, which is not great for people who are trying to access services, and it's not great for people who are trying to provide those services either. So we're trying to figure out how to make that faster and easier, and it's a really tricky problem to solve. Yeah, I'm seeing a hand. Okay. It's a really tricky problem to solve because the counties are also short-staffed. Everybody is short-staffed. We don't have enough workers to do all of the jobs in the state of Minnesota. And this is an assessment where you're looking at someone's financials, you're making sure that they qualify, you're trying to get access to different types of records. You know, it's a really complicated process and it's very labor intensive. And so as we have more people who might need to go through that assessment process, it just gets delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed. So we're trying to figure out how to fix that one, but it's just proving to be very, very sticky. I think the last one I'll cover is for your interest. So there is this really unique and special program called PACE. That is Program for All Inclusive Care for the Elderly. And it is a program that exists in 32 other states plus the District of Columbia. And it essentially allows someone who meets the criteria for nursing home placement to, instead of going to a nursing home, live in the community of their choosing, whether that's in their home, in a senior housing building, in an assisted living, you name the location, but it lets them stay where they would like to be and then gives them the accommodations that they need so that they can do that safely. So it might mean that they're bringing out someone to help them with their medication adherence. It might mean that they're giving them a refrigerator so that they can have better control of their diabetes medication. Some of these things are not very novel. They're pretty creative solutions. And the payment mechanism for these things is that the provider is given kind of a flat rate for managing the care of that individual. And as long as they come in under that flat rate, they kind of get to decide along with the beneficiary how to best meet their needs. So it is a really, really neat program that saves the state money, so the state wins, but also is better for residents, so the consumer wins. We've seen other states use this program to provide very inclusive care that helps reflect cultural practices. So like there's a really unique program in California for a community of Korean Americans. So it allows them to have their dietary preferences and their cultural practices in accordance with their values that also is consistent with their medical care plan. So we really want to see that come here. Minnesota is traditionally a very innovative state when it comes to its healthcare services. So it is a little befuddling to me that we haven't adopted it yet, but we're trying. How are we doing on time? Okay. Why don't we go ahead and skip? Okay. So here's the Walls budget in short. $218 million in cuts to nursing homes over 4 years, and a 54% increase in the fees to assisted living providers. Now, this is where it impacts consumers. If you were living in an assisted living facility, the reality is a 54% increase in fees to that provider would most likely correspond to some degree of rent increase to you. That's just kind of what happens. Those costs get passed through. That's what happens in any arrangement. If you go to the grocery store and the cost of eggs goes up to the supplier, the cost of eggs is going to go up to the to the consumer too. And so we have made the case that if you're going to do an increase of fees to that much, of that degree, that's actually not helpful to affordability for people who are trying to get into an assisted living community. All right, this is the last portion of my slides, and then we should have a little bit of time for question and answer. Grassroots advocacy, what is it? Why is it important? How can you get involved? Why do I think it has a critical place in the civic engagement process? Go ahead to the next slide. And thank you so much for your help. I'm sorry that the remote was beyond my capabilities today. So grassroots advocacy is the notion that all of us are a blade of grass and we get to influence our lawmakers by engaging in the civic process. So imagine me, I am a person of one. I am going to the legislature as a lobbyist and I am saying, you cannot adopt the governor's budget. Please reject the governor's budget and pass something else. I have one voice. I'm fairly good at my job, but I'm just one person. If you all came with me and said, I am a senior, you cannot cut senior services, you would have so much more impact because you're a much more authentic person to deliver that message. You have mass amongst you. There's a room of 35 people in here, and however many we have in rooms back in your apartments. So you get that groundswell of support. And it means that we're all saying the same thing and singing the same song, but bringing our different lived experience with us. So LeadingAge Minnesota is actually having a grassroots opportunity in 2 Wednesdays on March 19th, where we are bringing about 100 people to the Capitol to meet with their lawmakers. So they're all singing the same tune, saying the same thing and saying, I provide senior care services, or I am a senior, or I am the daughter of a 79-year-old person, and I don't want to see their services cut. And you get to do that in mass on the 19th. So I don't know if that is anything that is of interest to any of you. I don't know if your transportation means would allow you to attend. But if you have any interest in attending, I know that the registration date is kind of past us, but just reach out to me. I'll have my contact information on the slide. I know Joan has my contact information. We are more than happy to try to help make those arrangements because having your voices is so critical to this campaign and to this pursuit and to have a successful outcome at the end of the legislative session. Okay, so here are a couple of other examples. I believe some of you got to meet with Representative Pinto already. Don't let him off the hook. He is a really thoughtful lawmaker. He's been doing this a long time. He knows that hard decisions have to be made. He's a very reasonable person, but don't let him just worry about the federal cuts. Make sure he is also responsible for the state budget and for the governor's budget. We have seen people who are affiliated with my organization contact their lawmaker over 1,200 times already this session. My goal is to get that number past 7,000 before we get to May. So I'm an ambitious person, and I can be a nuisance if I need to be. So if I have to knock on doors and remind them to complete their action alert to contact their lawmaker, that's what I'm going to do. And don't forget that at the end of the day, your constituents, this is where you live. This is your home. So Representative Pinto, if you live here, is elected by you. He is accountable to you. Senator, who's got the Senate district? Is that Senator?
Aaron Murphy's this
Oh,
district.
Senator, okay, even better. Erin Murphy is the majority leader in the Senate. She is beholden to you as constituents. She was elected by the people who live in this district. So make sure you hold her accountable too for the governor's budget, for passing a budget that is responsible for seniors. Okay, next one. I think that wraps me up. So I know we started a little bit late. I'm happy to take questions if you'd like, Joan, or whatever you'd like to do from here.
Okay, I'll come around with the mic if there's a question or a comment. Maybe I'll just start by saying March the 19th, unfortunately, is our feast to St. Joseph, especially for a big community that lives here. So we have a little civic engagement and advocacy group meeting tomorrow. Maybe there's a way we could add our voices. And so what would be the best thing we should be writing to Dave Pinto or Aaron Murphy from your opinion?
That is a wonderful question. And yes, I can appreciate that the 19th doesn't work for everyone. The good news is they are in session until the third week of May. And there's probably a decent chance that they won't quite get done in May anyway, because they've had a little bit of a late start this year. So I would say if you can't come on the 19th, which again is very understandable, make sure you're inviting Representative Pinto and Senator Murphy out. Again, I know that he was here once, but don't let them be strangers. Have them come back and ask them to share with you where they stand on the governor's budget. And then I think it's helpful for you to explain why that governor's budget is so harmful and why you oppose the governor's budget and what you would rather see them do instead. And to me, what I would rather see them do instead is pay for the things that they value. If they value our growing population of older adults, and if they value the people who care for them, then they should prioritize those two things in their budget. At least that's my view. Yeah.
Is there any bill at this present time that is going through both the House and Senate?
Yes. So the bill that I could refer you to, there are probably a number of them, but one that I would draw your attention to is House File 1419. And in the Senate, that number is 1725. So in the House, it's 1419. And in the Senate, it is 1725. Now, to be fully transparent, I'll tell you what this bill does and what it doesn't do so that you know what you are advocating for if you choose to do that. So for my organization, this bill is incredibly important because it does three things. For nursing homes, it pays for the standards that have been passed by that board that I mentioned. And then it also gives in 2027, so 2 years from now, it would phase in a payment mechanism that represents the present day value of cost. Now, this gets very complicated, but essentially what happens is a nursing home invests in their expenses. They file a cost report, much like you would file a tax return. That cost report gets audited by the Department of Human Services. And then 2 years later, they get a new payment rate, what they're allowed to charge for services, either charged to the state or charged to a private pay resident. In that intervening 2-year period of time, if inflation changes, they don't get any sort of adjustment. So the value that they paid 2 years ago is now essentially underwater. So think about it like this. They are using their 2023 costs to pay for 2025 expenses. And the value of $2023 is not the same as the value of the $2025. So our bill tries to make that fix. And then the third thing that bill does is it changes how elderly waiver is calculated. An elderly waiver is how the vast majority of seniors who are low income access services like assisted living or home care. And elderly waiver is really important to the state of Minnesota, but it also uses outdated data that is not reflective of current data. So if you're looking at the average wage of a person working in assisted living today versus the average wage of a person working in assisted living in 2019, it's quite different. And so the data that they're using to calculate how much things cost has to be current, or else you're really underrepresenting and undervaluing how much those things actually cost. You know, I probably do have an electronic version that I could send you. Is that okay? Okay, I'll send you an electronic one.
We have a question in the back.
Yeah, for people with disabilities that are children and adults that aren't doing elderly waiver,
Yeah.
it must be quite I mean, that sounds like a big
Yeah,
loss.
yeah. I think this is what I find so distressing about the governor's budget and where he has chosen to make the spending cuts, acknowledging that some things have to be cut. To cut the disability waivers, which is the other place he saves a lot of money, that is really, really impactful to children who need wheelchair or accommodation in their school, if they need a special accommodation in their school. And I just don't quite understand. It seems to me like the budget represents just getting to a magic number on a spreadsheet and doesn't necessarily reflect what those numbers mean. But I can't imagine being a parent of a child with disabilities or being someone with a disability and facing that kind of a cut myself. The disability community is having their advocacy day on the 18th, so the day before ours, and we are actually working together to make sure that we're using a similar message because we rise together and we fall together.
Is anybody looking at the aspect of why there are so many vacancies and what the causes of people not wanting to go into those kind of services that you're talking to? And I can tell you what mine is.
I'd love
is
to hear.
I honestly think that for so many years, wages for people have not proportionately increased based
Yeah.
on what was going on in society in general. I'm talking about morality and all kinds of things, if anybody ever wants to go more into detail.
Yeah.
And it has affected where we are today. Because it isn't only that there are people being thrown out of the state, I'm speaking just from my heart, that really need to be here because they've been such wonderful supports for so many of them that are here, and how long they'll be here, we don't know based on what the direction the government will go.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering how many people really, by the way, I can repeat the question, was talking and spending enough time with people that are maybe had interests and look at and say, I can't live anymore on the kind of income that I get if I'm at this level or this one or this one. I think that deserves a real depth and a study in depth.
Yeah, I'm with you. My organization for the last 3 years introduced a bill in the legislature that would have brought up wages by about $5 an hour. The goal was to get people to, on average, $25 an hour by the year 2025. So we did that in 2022. We did that in 2023. We did. So our goal was always to try to increase wages, because at the end of the day, when you are in a place like Minnesota where you have more people aging into the retirement age group than not, you have to offer competitive wages and benefits. You have to, especially because this is a tough job and it's not a job for everyone. But that is really where the legislature needs to step up and play a role, because so many individuals receive services through Medicaid that Medicaid becomes the primary payer for things like wages. And unfortunately, the legislature had a $17 billion surplus in 2023, and they could not choose to prioritize wages in a year of that much abundance. We have done everything we can from the organization that I represent to really motivate the legislature to prioritize those types of things. And the powers that be at the time made investments in other areas. So I think that is a huge part of it. I think, maybe the second thing that is driving some of this is some of that macroeconomic condition that we find ourselves in. If you are someone who is 18 to 30, the world could kind of be your oyster right now. There are so many places that you could choose to work if you wanted to. Yeah, for higher salaries, for a job that, maybe isn't quite as laborious. And I think there's also this, it makes me uncomfortable to say out loud, but I do think that there is a cultural or a generational difference that we're starting to see too, in that I don't know that we in the United States in particular think about the honor and the dignity of caring for older adults the same way that perhaps some other countries do. And I do think that that shows up perhaps implicitly in some of the policies that move forward, in some of the choices we all make as individuals. So there's a little bit of that that I worry about too. And I think that's why you see a lot of new Americans and immigrant communities really leaning into these types of caring professions. It's because they have a cultural practice around wanting to recognize and honor their elders. And I know we are hugely supportive of our immigrant workforce and are trying to do all we can to make sure that they feel supported and safe in a complicated political environment.
Let me just add to that. I mean, we have a daughter who's from Korea who is working in a long-term care facility, not too dissimilar from this. And, you know, the wages are, it's not a living wage. You just can't possibly survive on that. And the business of increasing wages is absolutely critical to make this go. And what we're doing in terms of the other question I had, you just mentioned that your organization focuses on immigration relative to the concern. What we're doing in this country is driving exactly the kind of people we need entering these professions out, you know, deporting people. You know, the impact of what's going on at the federal level on the workforce here, which is already nowhere near enough people doing these kinds of jobs, we're driving them out. What are you doing about that? What specifically is your organization doing about that in terms of immigration policy?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I'll answer it in a couple of ways. Here in the state of Minnesota, as you all know, because you're a very informed group, state lawmakers don't have a ton of control over what the federal government chooses to do or not do. However, we are doing a couple of things at the state level, and then we're doing a couple of things at the federal level as well. So at the state level, LeadingAge Minnesota, the organization that I work for, worked with the legislature in 2023 to use some funding, some of that $17 billion surplus, to create a grant program called the New Americans Grant. And I can't remember how much money went into that grant, but it was a fairly substantial investment. And the goal of that grant is for people who, for organizations to apply as a grantee and then use that money to support building communities and building familial safety in our immigrant workforce. And so LeadingAge Minnesota not only supported the legislation that created that program, but we also became a grantee, and we had the benefit of receiving about $1 million that we are now using to support caring immigrant families and making sure that they have the legal need or support that they need to process their visas to stay here to receive that protected status. And then similarly at the federal level, we work with several national organizations to support immigration policy. We've been working with Senator Klobuchar's office to pass the Healthcare Resilience Workforce Act. I don't remember the number off of the top of my head, but there are about 48, I believe, thousand visas that are unclaimed right now of a specific visa type that we would like to have dedicated to healthcare workers to allow individuals from other countries who want to come here and work as a healthcare worker, like a registered nurse, come and work here and receive one of those visas. And it has bipartisan support. So it has bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. So really, we're putting a lot of pressure on the administration to support that legislation as well.
I'm wondering, I have always thought Walz was a pretty good governor, and I'm trying to understand why he's taking this position on this. Do you have any idea why? And what could, you know, what's motivating him?
Yeah, I can't speak for him, obviously. I think what I can reflect is the stuff that I have seen and heard from him, and then I can reflect on the 20 years or so that I've done this work and known how budgets are offered and how the process plays out. So I think it's a couple of things. I do think, given his background and his expertise, he is always going to prioritize K through 12 education. I don't think that's really a secret for anybody here. And in light of scarce resources, he's choosing to prioritize that. And I think every governor, every elected official has the ability to pick what they want to prioritize on. So I don't really, I have no opinion on whether he's making the right choice or the wrong choice. I think that is his choice. And then I think another thing that is playing out is he knows that senior care is an issue that Republicans do really care about. It's something that they have consistently raised as a priority for their caucus. And so I think there is a bit of political negotiation that he is betting on, that if he chooses this thing and they choose that thing, that when they go to negotiate a final deal, they have room to counter back and forth and land somewhere in the middle. So I think there's a little bit of chess happening here as well. And then the third thing is, the governor, any governor, not just Governor Walz, has to produce a budget in January. He's required to do it. I think he saw the forecast, and I think he had to put together numbers on a page, and he knew that this was just step one of a 10-step process. But beyond that, you might have to find out from him.
Well, maybe for our last question, I'm just curious, what are you hearing in terms of the Senate and the House? Are they in line with the governor's budget? What's the rumblings? And maybe a more broader question in the sense, as a non-math accountant person, in reality, the forecast is saying we do have a surplus for the next 2 years. Do we really need to make cuts?
I think that's a really great question to ask of the governor. So what I'm hearing from the legislature, to me, gives me a fair amount of optimism. The Senate, on a bipartisan basis, has really decried the budget cuts. They do not support cuts to people with disabilities or to seniors or to kids who need special education accommodations. They think that there is a different path forward. The House, I think they are still a little more measured in how to respond. I think they don't want to have to make those cuts either, but the things I'm hearing most often are, but we have this federal budget hanging over our heads. And so I think they're trying to find their way. And then I think not only is there a $616 million surplus for this biennium, we also have about $3.5 billion tucked away in our reserve. We have a really healthy rainy day fund, and we have a rainy day fund for a reason. It is to protect us against things like deficits. So while I don't recommend that we raid that fund and pay for every pet project of every lawmaker who's ever existed, I do think it is probably time to consider if the legislature needs to use any of that rainy day fund, if not this year, then certainly to protect against the shortfall in the next biennium. So even though we have this really big deficit looming over our heads, know that we have a healthy rainy day fund to help insulate some of those things.
Did you learn anything? Thank you very much, Aaron. This has been delightful. And I guess as my mind is going, the Civic Engagement Group is meeting on Friday morning at 10 o'clock in the art room. If any of you are interested in joining us, we would welcome you, and I'm in the directory. If you want to give me a call, would be very happy to talk with any of you. But for me, we've gotten a lot of ideas of what we can talk about at the meeting on Friday morning. And there's Marty, there's Sharon, and there's Janet and myself. That's it. So we could use more people if you would be interested. So again, thank you, Aaron, so much for coming. Yeah. And I have one more question of you here. What would you think of our joining Leading Age Minnesota? Any idea? I see a lot of